This is Chapter 16, Section 3 on the formation of species. How many species of organisms exist on Earth today? Undiscovered species are so numerous that we have no accurate answer. For example, even small areas of tropical rainforest can contain thousands of species of plants, animals, and microorganisms. New species are discovered and others become extinct at an incredible rate. In this section, you will learn how one species can become two through a process called speciation. So the process of speciation is literally just the process of a species being formed. It results in many related populations of organisms. Some of those populations are very similar to the shared ancestors and some are different. Now, scientists have used two methods of classifying species. The first one is a morphological concept of what a species is, and morphology is the structure and appearance of an organism. Using this, species are primarily identified according to their structure and appearance. That is called morphology. Obviously, this would be probably one of the first methods that's used because it is very easy to look at two organisms and say they look significantly similar enough that we can classify them as belonging to the same species. However, the morphological concept of species has limitations. There can be phenotypic differences among individuals in in a single population. And besides this example I have here of two species of, I think they're macaques, I could be wrong, obviously a kind of monkey, but these are members of the same species, although if you were to look at them, you would probably identify them as being different. Another great example is humans. There are over 7.5 billion of us, and we range from height and weight and body structure, color of our skin, eyes, hair, all of that. So if you were, for example, an alien that just came to Earth, you might conclude that we are members of different species based on that. Another example is the species Canis familiaris, or the domesticated dog. All of the dogs are the same species. That's why we can interbreed a Labrador with a poodle and get a Labradoodle, or a golden retriever and a poodle and get a golden, no, yeah, it's a golden doodle, whatever. We can interbreed different types of dogs and get new hybrids. The second approach to identifying a species is identifying a species as that which you can have individuals successfully breed with other members. So this, however, does not provide definition for species that are already extinct, because obviously we cannot know who they could or could not breed with. So the modern definition of species includes a combination of both. So how does a species create a new species? It begins with isolation. So you have two parts of a formerly interbreeding population that stop interbreeding. There's two ways that a species can become isolated. The first one, which should be common sense, is geographic isolation, where you have whether they migrate to different areas or there's some kind of like earthquake, volcanic eruption, fire, something like that, some kind of natural disaster, which splits up a population. But obviously this would be like the most common sense, logical way that a species would become two different species if they got physically isolated. The second type of isolating mechanism is reproductive, which is a little bit more maybe nuanced or complicated. So we'll start with geographic isolation. This is a physical separation when the original habitat becomes divided, or it could also happen through migration if a population migrates, but they migrate to two different areas. So like I said, examples of ways that a habitat could be divided: a river changes course, or a deep canyon develops, or like I said, due to either climate change or some kind of natural disaster, the population might be forced to move. So this is an example of how this species of fish became two different species. You can see, let me get my little laser pointer. So we have North America and South America. This is Central America here. And about 3.5 million years ago, you had what's called the isthmus, I don't know, of Panama. And an isthmus is a narrow strip of land. So this came about 3.5 million years ago. So this used to be open. And then 3.5 million years ago, the land formed, which then cut off these two, these look like cichlids. And so you have the Panamic porkfish and the porkfish here. So you see the genus is the same, Anisotremus, but the species, we have genus and species, which we'll learn about that in the next chapter, either the next one or 18, I can't remember. But when you name a species with a scientific name, it's always genus first and then species second. So when you name the human being, that's Homo sapiens. So this is the genus. Homo means man, and sapiens means wise. So our species name is wise man. The species that came before us was Homo habilis. Habilis means handy. So handyman, because this was the ancestor of ours that learned how to use tools. So then we call them handyman. The one before that was Homo erectus. Erectus means upright. So this was the first ancestor of modern man that stood upright instead of being hunched over. If you think about the apes, like a gorilla, orangutan, chimpanzee, that they're hunched over, Homo erectus was the first man that stood upright. So those are our ancestors. Before Homo erectus, man didn't exist. We didn't have a human because human is Homo. Before that, you had Australopithecus, which was another ancestor. Anyway. Okay, so then that's geographic isolation. Like I said, it can happen in a myriad of ways. The second type of isolation is called reproductive isolation. This results from barriers to successful breeding between population groups in the same area. Now, how do you have barriers to successful breeding? And you can have it in a couple of different ways. It could happen through disruptive selection. Remember, disruptive selection is when you have either of two extremes that are selected as being advantageous. So if you have some members of the species which evolved on one end and some species evolved on the other end, that could be a disruptive barrier to breeding. There are two main types of reproductive isolation. One is called pre-zygotic isolation, which is before fertilization, and post-zygotic isolation, which is after fertilization. And I will clarify the two coming up.
Thanks for stopping by. Today we are talking about speciation. Speciation is the formation of one or more new unique species from a current species. In order for one species to split into two or more, a faction within the species must not share its genetic information with the rest of the species. This is called reproductive isolation, and there are two main categories of contributors to this isolation: prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers, so named for whether they occur before or after fertilization. Prezygotic barriers result when two groups within a species isolate themselves from one another in some way. So let's look at some examples. Temporal isolation occurs when members of the same species are active at different times of the day, month, or even year. More specifically, they breed at different times. For example, if some members of a group breed during the day and others breed during the night, they are isolating themselves from one another and not sharing genetic information. The same would be true for one group breeding in the spring and the other breeding in the fall, again, both from the same species. Behavioral isolation is another. In this case, members of the same species behave differently, especially with their mating practices. So these members may have slightly different mating rituals that don't attract members of the other group, thus isolating who they mate with. Others include mechanical isolation, where some members physically can't mate with others, habitat isolation, where the habitat occupied by members of a species differs and thus breeding interactions differ, and gametic isolation, which occurs in aquatic animals. You can learn more about all of these by following the links in the description. Now to post-zygotic barriers. Again, these barriers occur after fertilization has occurred, so mating happens, but no viable or fertile offspring is produced. These include reduced hybrid viability, in which case there is successful fertilization, but development is not successful or results in very weak offspring, which is prone to early death. Another example is reduced hybrid fertility, in which case a mating is successful at producing offspring, a hybrid of the parents, but the offspring is not fertile and thus produces no offspring of its own. The classic case is a mule, the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. The mule lives a full life and can function just fine, except when it comes to reproducing. This is one reason that donkeys and horses are considered to be different species. A final example of post-zygotic barrier is hybrid breakdown, in which offspring is produced, and that offspring may be able to reproduce, but the second generation will be weak and or sterile. Speciation, as we've talked about with respect to reproductive barriers, is a complicated topic which I've done my best to simplify. So if this video helped you, give it a like, and if you have more questions, please throw them in the comments.
Okay, so let's look at both pre and post zygotic isolation. An example of pre-zygotic isolation, remember this is a reproductive isolation that occurs before fertilization. This could be incompatible behavior, a really, really good example to kind of put it in your mind. What it means by pre-zygotic isolation is you think about frogs mating calls. Really easy to think about, especially here in Thailand in the rainy season. After it rains, you can hear so many different types of frogs mating. Each species has its own specific mating call, and the females innately or automatically understand how to recognize her own species mating call. So that prevents different species of frogs mating together. You also have a difference in mating times. So in this picture I have here, you've got different times of the year, and you have these different insects. So you've got we'll just look at the beetles, right? So you've got flea beetles and red turnip beetles. They're both beetles. Hopefully you guys know what a beetle is. But the flea beetles only reproduce during May and June, and red turnip beetles are between, let's say, mid-June to mid-August. Same thing with these cutworms and Bertha armyworms. If you have different reproductive times of the year, then that pretty much ensures that similar species of animals aren't going to reproduce with each other because they have different times. And finally, we have post-zygotic isolation. If two interbreeding species mate and fertilization occurs, the success of that mating is measured by the production of healthy, and here's the big key, fertile offspring. So an example, the offspring, if you do have two different species that successfully mate and fertilization occurs, especially just thinking about the number of chromosomes, because each species has a specific set number of chromosomes. And if you have two different species mating together, that means the egg from one and the sperm from the other are going to have different numbers of chromosomes. So the offspring might not even develop because, for example, I think chimpanzees, if I'm not mistaken, have either 44 or 48 chromosomes. I can't remember which. But either way, if you have a human being, and I know it sounds disgusting, but it's just as an experiment, like a thought experiment. If you have a human being that successfully mates with a chimpanzee, you have the incorrect number of chromosomes to create either a human or a chimpanzee, and so you're going to end up not even having a fetus develop because if you combine, let's say humans is 23, and let's just say chimpanzees are 48. So that's 23 and 24, that's 47. Well, 47 is not a human and 47 is not a chimpanzee. So it's just gonna like not form into anything because it's just you're not creating the proper number of chromosomes. So then it can result in the fetus not even developing, or it might die. Even if something does form, it might die shortly after birth. And the best example is producing offspring that are not fertile. So we consider those wasted gametes that make offspring that can't reproduce. Because remember, reproduction, the sole purpose of reproduction is to continue the species. So if you successfully reproduce, but your offspring cannot reproduce, then those gametes are wasted because the line doesn't continue after that. So the best example is a horse mating with a donkey, and that makes a mule. Another word for mule is called a jackass. I know, haha, but that's like literally what they call them, jackass. And mules are sterile. So it does produce an animal, and the animal is born and it survives because horses and donkeys are closely enough related that they can produce a viable living organism, but that mule cannot reproduce by itself. So we have a horse on the left and a donkey on the right, and they produce a mule, which you see here on the bottom. So mules can survive, but they can't reproduce. Now, we can look at the rate of speciation by looking at these two different trees here. Most of the speciation is going to occur in this manner. This is called graduated or gradual speciation, which means it's just a gradual change. So yeah, so you have like these very slow kind of curvy lines that kind of go off in different directions. The other kind of speciation is called punctuated. Now, this is going to occur very abruptly. So you might have like some kind of natural disaster which wipes out part of a whole population, and then you have like this huge change. But punctuated speciation is going to occur with a rapid change in genotype or phenotype, both over a short period of time.
Thanks for stopping by. Today we're talking about gradualism, punctuated equilibrium, and catastrophism. Now, these are all processes of evolution. The first one we'll talk about, gradualism, is small changes in evolution over time. All right, so small changes occur gradually, and these small changes can add up to result in large changes or large evolutionary changes within a species or between species. Right? This can be observed in the fossil record by looking at similar but different species, so they can compare and see these small changes. With punctuated equilibrium, you have a long time with no change, that's the equilibrium, and then a sudden large change in a short amount of time, which is the punctuated portion. Ironically, this is also supported by the fossil record with the gaps that occur between fossils, and so it eliminates the need for those gaps to be filled by missing links. Right? It just says there is no missing link in there. It's just a time with no change, and then there was sudden large change later. Catastrophism is a subcomponent of punctuated equilibrium, so it fits under that heading. And when you have natural disasters that cause sudden changes in an ecosystem, then those changes result in rapid evolution by new species moving in and adapting and taking over that ecosystem. And that's catastrophism. And so which one is accurate? Which one is the one that scientists and scholars use between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium? Well, they're actually both accepted as a viable process of evolution, and it may even be a combination of both which occurs and which is probably most likely.